you may be somebody here tonight wanting one of the other three things that we've talked about, the peace, the provision, or the belonging. But the reality of all of this is, before any of those things can be received in their fullest measure, as people, we have to receive grace. You might be coming in here tonight, bringing something with you where you need provision, right? There might be something kind of weighing on you. And I love when a story ends like the one that we saw. But what do we do when we're praying and we're asking for God to come through and we don't feel like the provisions come in the nick of time or when we need it most? What do we do when we get through another Christmas and it feels like the timeline to our prayers have been delayed, or worse, we feel like they've been ignored altogether? How do we function? How do we cope with that kind of reality? Now, this reminds me of the story of the wise men who come to bring gifts for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. We're told that these wise men come from the east and they follow this star to try and find the king that they thought had been born recently because they wanted to bring these gifts for him. Right? And if you've been around church at all, or if you've heard this story before, you're probably at least familiar with a couple of these gifts and what they're called, right? We know them as gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, obviously, we all know what gold is, but the frankincense and myrrh can maybe be a little bit confusing. And so what I've tried to do in our kind of modern context is I began to think, like, what would be some kind of contemporary things that we would kind of understand that would highlight the value of what these presents were. Because actually, in our story, what we know is that all three of these presents have both practical value and also spiritual significance in terms of what they mean as gifts for a king. So what I've done here is up on these screens, you'll see we've kind of put them in order in their contemporary examples. So the first one obviously is gold, right? We all know what gold is. Gold is valuable, but the spiritual significance for Jesus is that it also would have been kind of what you would give to a king. You would bring him gold. And so the modern day equivalent for us would be something like gift cards, especially at Christmas time, right? Like, we don't want any weird stuff from mom, dad, grandma, or Uncle Larry, right? We want something that we can just pick out on our own. So just give us a good gift card and then get out of the way. Right? And then the next one is frankincense. Now, maybe a little less familiar for some of you there, but frankincense in antiquity, in Jesus' day, would have been used as this like temple aroma to bring a pleasing smell to God. And so I was thinking, all right, well, what's the spiritual significance for us today, right? What brings us closer to God? And the thing that I could think of was essential oils, because peppermint is heavenly, and I don't care what you say, all right? And then our final one here is probably the least familiar, I would imagine, unless you're like a history person or something, but this is called myrrh. All right, so myrrh is this ancient spice that merchants would trade back and forth. It had a lot of value, but it also kind of contained within it like these healing properties, right? It was used like as a balm, like when you would fall down and you'd get a cut. It would be things that you would put on it to like keep it from getting infected. It could kind of help heal. And then there's kind of like this weirder side to myrrh as well. It's got this thing that would be used as an embalming fluid for people who had died, right? And so if you just kind of carve off that weird section over here, I think the modern day equivalent of that would be Neosporin for you and me, right? So you use Neosporin on cuts, and Jesus as a baby probably would have been wandering around and fall down and hurt himself there. And so please don't embalm anyone or try to do that with Neosporin this season. If that's you, that's on your own. That's your own risk there. But the idea, if you think about all of these gifts, they all are practical in their value. They are all very timely. But when you consider things from Mary's perspective, it looks a little different, actually. Because you've got this group of wealthy men who show up and say, hey, we came as quick as we could. We saw the star and we followed it all the way from the east to be here because we wanted to meet your baby newborn king, because we wanted to bring these gifts and worship him. And then from Mary, you look down and you see that the newborn baby that they're talking about actually isn't a newborn baby, right? Your newborn baby's now a toddler that's eating dirt, trying to wrestle with Joseph, is causing some trouble. These men show up and bring these valuable provisions. These would have been certainly helpful for Mary and her family. They would have blessed her immensely. But God provided for Mary in this unexpected way. But the thing that we actually might miss in our contemporary setting sometimes is the understanding of the timeline that most likely would have occurred for this provision to take place. You see, it's actually important to remember that these men weren't at Jesus' birth, right? If you've ever watched like the Charlie Brown Christmas story, or if you've ever seen any type of, kind of nativity, right? We always make this assumption that when you kind of see these three guys huddled in the corner, right? You've got like the donkey and the stable and the sheep and the goat and the little drummer boy and some of them. And there's like these three dudes over here that have these gifts like in treasure chests almost, that we tend to think that these guys were there on the night of their birth. Well, so two things, right? That's not what we can learn from the scripture. When Herod makes this decree in the Gospel of Matthew to take away all the boys that are 2 and under, it probably indicates that there was some type of delay there. But there's actually, the scriptures don't even tell us that there's 3 wise men. We just make that, kind of association because there's 3 gifts here. And so if it takes them a few years to find her, for God to bring these helpful provisions into her life, my question comes back to you and say, what do we do when God isn't providing for us on the timeline that we feel like we need him to provide for? How do we hold on when we are in a deep season of physical need? How do we hold on when we're trying to figure out if or how or if it's ever even possible to mend broken relationships? And I think if you're in here and this is where you're at tonight, there may be a sense of frustration that you hear like another preacher telling you to like just hold on and trust God, and I can promise you that he's working things for you. And it's like, yeah, you can say all of that, but it doesn't change the immediate situation, right? It's not like a Neosporin for the spiritual balm that you're walking through. But the reality is that God is working and God is moving. But God's timeline might not always look like yours and mine. So if you are a person for whom this is true this year, if this is what you need for God to break through and bring some type of provision in your life, for the last time, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that for just a moment. Because you may be somebody here tonight wanting one of the other 3 things that we've talked about, the peace, the provision, or the belonging. But the reality of all of this is, before any of those things can be received in their fullest measure, as people, we have to receive grace. Because when you receive the grace of Jesus Christ, all of those other things become available to you in their fullest measure. We've talked about tables a lot tonight. But there's another table that I want to tell you about. And it's the table that Jesus sat at the night before he would end up being crucified. He sits at this table with his closest friends, his disciples, and confidants, and he institutes this ritual that we still practice some 2,000 years later called communion. He talks about this bread that they eat, that's his body that's going to be broken for them. And then the wine that they drink is his blood that's spilled out on their behalf. You see, Jesus' whole purpose was to come to earth and to live this perfect life and close this gap that none of us could close on our own. Each of us bring with us this notion of sin that keeps us from being able to enter into God's presence. And so what's so powerful and remarkable about Christmas is it represents the creator of the universe declaring that he's going to come and enter into your presence. That his birth is this demarcation of a new period in history where through Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, all of us have access to God the Father. That as a person, when you receive that and when you take that step to make his grace your own, it enables you to have a relationship with him, all because of the grace of Christ. While Jesus died, the best news of all is that he didn't stay dead. That resurrection that came 3 days later defeated everything that we bring with us here tonight. That it reestablishes, it reorients, it reprioritizes every other thing that might get in our way. That it allows us to have the opportunity to give our life to Jesus. Around here, when we talk about this phrase, receiving grace, what we mean by that is making this declaration to follow Christ for the very first time. To throw your hands up and say, it's not my timeline anymore. It's not me. I'm not going to try and be in charge. I recognize that there is something in me that longs for something greater than what anything in this world has to offer. that the person who can bring my pieces back to whole is Jesus. That gives me belonging is Jesus. That gives me provision is Jesus. This is the invitation that awaits you this evening. All you need to do is receive grace, accept Christ's invitation, his bid for you to come, and to know that the whole point of his birth 2,000 years ago was to be able to tie directly into the cross. That what makes Jesus' birth profound and powerful and important is because he would willingly step into a place where he didn't have to take on a punishment that wasn't his. The beauty and the bounty of God's capacity to be everything you need begins today.